Hello YouTube! Today we're going to be doing part 3 of my Scandi series. We're going to be going over e4, d5, and then after e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, we're going to be looking at this retreat queen to d6. Now, the way queen d6 is different than both queen a5 or queen d8 is queen a5 is trying to play more of a Caro-Kann by transposition. That's the way most people are trying to play it when they play queen a5. And queen d8 is trying to play more of a French defense by transposition. Queen d6 is unique because what queen d6 is trying to do is it's trying to play more of an independent line. It's trying to basically just play like an independent Scandinavian line, but still maintain that French defense or that Caro-Kann move order. So before we go any further, if you do like this content and you like this type of content, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. It really does help in me bringing you more content like this. So anyways, after queen to d6, what is black trying to do? And of course, what is white trying to do? So one of the ideas in this independent line in the Scandi is black is trying to put a lot of pressure on the d4 square. So let's just say that white continues with the normal move here, pawn to d4. Black is putting pressure on this d4 square. And black can actually put so much pressure on d4, and he can keep ratcheting up this pressure so much and in such a way that he can eventually almost win this pawn by force. It's actually very difficult for white to defend this pawn in a fluid way that doesn't mess up the placement of his pieces so badly that he just ends up in trouble. So basically, white is going to have to lose this pawn at some point if he plays natural-looking moves. Now, on the other hand, this isn't such a bad thing for white, because what white should be doing in this type of position is he should be playing natural moves, and he should be putting his pieces on natural squares. And then what's interesting about that is when he gets all of these great placed pieces, when he gets his pieces on beautiful open lines and open diagonals, the one thing that he's going to be lacking is the open files to totally utilize his beautiful piece placement and his extra space to full advantage. So actually white sort of wants to lose this pawn. Actually, white would prefer to lose this pawn so that he can get the open files and he can get the open lines and he can get the attacks that he wants to get with these open files and lines. So, to summarize, black is going to put a lot of effort into winning this pawn. But this is one of those cases of black should kind of be careful what he wishes for. Because by the time black finally does win this pawn, white is going to be extremely happy because by getting rid of that pawn, white is going to be able to have the open files and the open diagonals that he needs to continue with his attack. And white is going to have more than enough compensation for that pawn and should enjoy a very easy advantage. Now, early on, one of the things that black has to worry about is just the placement of this queen in general on the d6 square. He has to worry about these early knight b5s. So like after knight f6, knight f3, black is really going to have to play this early a6 move to prevent this knight b5 from hitting the queen and hitting the c7 square. If he plays something that's not a6, like if he plays knight c6 for instance, white can throw in knight b5, which attacks the queen and attacks c7, and then after black retreats with queen d8, white actually has two options available. He can play the caveman approach. He can play bishop f4, knight d5, bishop g3. This should be slight edge white just because white has a little bit extra space. But even stronger after queen d8 is just a hammer blow in the middle of the board. White can play the move pawn to d5. What's cute about this move is black can't actually take this pawn. If black were to play the move knight takes d5, you can pause the video and see if you can find it. White would simply play queen takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c7 check, family fork, and then when we take the queen on d5, we're going to be up an entire piece. So after the move pawn to d5, black's best would be to simply move the knight, and then white would just defend the pawn and just enjoy more space with a much better position. So after the move pawn to a6, what white should do, my recommendation is to play the move pawn to g3, preparing to develop this bishop to the long diagonal. And here's my little piece of positional advice in this particular position. What I've learned from playing against the queen d6 Scandi is defending the d4 pawn long term is pretty much hopeless. So the idea is you want to be able to give up this pawn in a way that makes sense. And the biggest secret that I've learned about that is don't let your queen run out of air. So like after bishop g4, what's really kind of anti-instinctual is you would think, hey, I'm getting pinned. Maybe I want to cut that pin off with a move like, say, bishop e2. You most certainly do not. And the reason is you really want that e2 square available for your queen at all times. Losing the pawn on d4, not such a big deal. But if your queen runs out of oxygen, that can actually be a very big deal. You always want to have a square available for your queen. So that's my biggest piece of advice in playing against the Queen d6 Scandi, is keep that e2 square open. No matter how you choose to develop your pieces, keep that e2 square open for your queen at all times, because losing the pawn on d4, not necessarily a big deal. That's probably just going to open up lines and open up files for your pieces. But if your queen doesn't have a place to go to that's not on that d file, that is actually a pretty big deal. So leave that e2 square open. That's my biggest piece of advice. So bishop g2, just putting the bishop on the long diagonal, and you can see the e2 square is wide open for the queen, no problem. So now we have to keep asking ourselves, okay, he's got pressure on d4. Can he take this pawn? And we can ask ourselves this question pretty much every single move. So we can start with this move. Can he take the pawn? Can he play, say, bishop takes f3 and go for this pawn? Well, for starters, we could just play bishop f3. We're still holding the pawn. But this would be a great time to get our queen out of the way, too. We could play queen takes f3, and he really can't play queen takes d4 because we're going to play queen takes b7, and not only do we get our pawn back, we're winning the rook on a8 as well. So can he take the pawn? Can he play bishop f3 and take the pawn? No. So usually what black does is black builds up to it. He plays knight c6, and he puts more pressure on our d4 pawn. So, oh no, we've got a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn. We're probably going to lose it. That's fine. You know, like I said, black can just do this. Black can build pressure on the d4 pawn. We're just going to castle as if nothing is happening. So can black take the d4 pawn now? So if black immediately plays knight takes d4, we would take the knight with the queen, and that's a whole knight, because now our knight is no longer pinned, so our knight is now holding our queen. So that's just a whole piece. So he can't play knight takes d4. So could he play instead bishop takes f3? In this case, we would take back with the bishop, and then it looks like there's two ways to capture, but they both totally fail. If queen captures d4, you can pause the video and see if you can find the move. We have bishop takes c6, bishop c6, queen d4, up an entire queen. By the way, a queen is more than enough compensation for a pawn, just to let you know. So the other option is knight takes d4, in which case we would simply play bishop takes b7, and this king is in the middle of the board with weak light squares. We're gaining the tempo against the rook. We're not even down a pawn in this position, and our king on g1 is very, very safe. This would be major advantage white after simply bishop takes b7. So to answer the question of can they go for this pawn right now after a castle's kingside, the answer to that question is no. So usually what they do is they castle queenside, and they basically say, hey, I'm going to win this pawn on d4, and there is nothing you can do about it. I have focused all my energy and every single move on winning this pawn on d4. Ha, I finally won this pawn on d4. But I want you to look at white's pieces and look at where black's king is located. Black's king is located on the queenside right now. And we're going to have both of our bishops on wide open diagonals that are going to be aiming at the black king. So we're going to be playing bishop f4. We're going to be hitting that queen on d6. We're going to have both bishops on wide open diagonals at some point. It could be either the f4 diagonal or possibly even the e3 diagonal. But both of our bishops are going to be on open diagonals aiming at the king. And the only thing we really lack is open files. If we could get both open diagonals and open files to aim at the black king, we would be very, very happy. So yes, black has forced the win of the pawn on d4. But at the same time, white would actually like to rid himself of this pawn so he can bring his rooks into this attack that his bishops are going to be involved in. So there's a couple of different ways that you can play this here. You could actually just play the move pawn to d5. This is probably the move that I recommend. But I'm also not opposed to the move pawn to h3. They both have their fair points. Now, if they retreat the bishop to h5, we can of course just play g4, breaking the pin, and this should be slight advantage white. But after h3, if he takes on f3, we can take back with the queen. We can offer him this pawn on d4, and of course he can't take with the knight because we have queen takes b7, which is going to be winning. So they're going to have to take with the queen. And now we have what we want. We have our open files for the attack. So we would bring our rook into the attack. The queen would retreat to d6, and then we'd bring our bishop into the attack. We have both bishops on diagonals aiming at the king, and of course now we have this rook on this open file. Now, the queen, interestingly enough, it's kind of running out of options. It almost has to take this pawn on b2. But when it takes the pawn on b2, and we continue with knight a4, we have tons of open lines for our pieces, tons of open files. We're going to have an open D file, an open B file. We're going to be bringing this knight into C5. And while we're doing all this bishop on F8 and this rook on H8 still haven't developed yet. And this pawn on E7 is going to have to move to facilitate that. Meanwhile, the queen is being attacked. So probably black's best here is just rook takes d1, and then we should actually take back with the queen to make sure that we still have rook b1 available to us to continue this attack, and you'll see why in a minute. After queen a3, we need to bring this knight into c5 and put that pressure on the b7 square, because after they try to develop their king side, we have this really cool sacrifice, knight takes b7. After king b7, rook b1, notice that this knight is pinned. So if this king moves away, we're going to be taking this knight for free. And after we take that knight for free, black is going to be in a world of trouble. So the only thing that black has to try to stay in the game is to play a move like bishop b4, blocking it up, which looks smart, but it's actually not very smart because we have the move pawn to c3, which would win the bishop. So they're going to have to take it with the queen, and then we simply play rook c1, going after this knight. And this is kind of how you attack. When you have open files, and you have a weak king like this, you just open the king up further, you utilize your open files, utilize your open diagonals, and you just kind of keep going after your opponent. So then queen a3 we're going to take with the rook. The king's going to have to step out of the discoveries, and then you can win the game with just a very simple exchange sack here. You sack the exchange, you bring the queen in with check. When the king goes here, you threaten mate. And what's interesting about this mate threat is the only way black has to stop it is to give up his bishop on b4. He has to play queen d3, and then we take the bishop on b4. And now it's the queen and two bishops creating mate threats versus this rook on h8. And this position is just kind of hopeless. So they can throw in a couple of checks, and we're going to have to play some safety moves. After queen d6 to exchange queens, we say no. We play queen c4 to hold the bishop temporarily. They can play f5 to try to disrupt our pieces before we're set in place. We can actually throw in this check and then retreat, which helped us gain control of the e6 square. They can play h5, we can be patient, we can play h4, they can move their rook, we can shuffle our bishop back so that the queen doesn't have to babysit it. Now we're simply threatening bishop c5, and that's going to be totally winning. Black's position is just nearly frozen at this point. So f4, bishop c5, check, check again, the king finally hides, and notice that these bishops and this queen are cutting off every part of these diagonals. This rook's only move is going to actually be just to go all the way back to h8, and then we're going to come in with the queen, which threatens two different checkmates. It threatens bishop e7 mate, and it threatens queen e8 mate if they play rook h7 to block. So if they just play some random move, like say e4, we're going to play bishop e7 with mate. And that's kind of how you conduct these kinds of attacks. When you have your bishop pair and your diagonals aiming at the black king, this is how you build your position, this is how you conduct your attack. You open up your files, you open up your diagonals, and then you sacrifice your material to break through, and then you end up with just better pieces than your opponent. So the other way that you can go after your opponent is instead of the move pawn to h3, you can of course play, I think, maybe the more sophisticated move. You can play the move d5, and then knight b4, and now we play pawn to h3. And this is another kind of very difficult move to deal with. So for starters, they could retreat. They could play bishop h5, in which case you can play bishop f4, queen c5, bishop e3, queen d6, and then I simply recommend queen e2. And again, with the two bishops and everything aiming in the right spot, and this is again another really critical reason I love leaving that e2 square open, because eventually we're really going to kind of want to sidestep to get out of the way of ourselves. Because again, we don't really care so much if we lose this pawn on d5. We just want to make sure that we get our play. And when we sidestep with the queen, when they take on d5, and we take, and we bring this rook to d1, our queen is very well placed out of the way to help bring the rest of our pieces into this attack and help open up these diagonals and these lines and these files in the exact way that we want to keep playing for that advantage and keep playing for that initiative. So after h3, the alternative to bishop h5 is just simply bishop takes f3, in which case we should take back with the queen. And no, we are not worried about them taking on c2. If they play knight takes c2, if you want to pause the video and see if you can find the move, we have the very simple fork, queen f5 check, and then after king b8, we simply take the free knight, and white is up a whole knight. So after queen takes f3, they're going to play knight on b to d5, and the game we're following is actually Nikolenko versus Yuzakov, which was played in Russia in 2009. And that game actually continued with rook d1, taking advantage of the open file. e6, knight d5, e d5, and then simply c4. Black was forced to play c6, but of course this starts looking ugly really fast. Bishop f4, and we're cutting off that black king. This black king is very poorly located on this queen side now. With the open diagonals, the king is basically in the middle of the board at this point, being attacked. And we have two bishops beautifully aiming at the king. I'm going to sacrifice a pawn all day long for positions like this. So rook e1, taking full advantage of the open files. And then one of the cool critical ideas here is at some point white actually manages to improve the position of his bishop on g2 with the move h4 and bishop h3, because black starts running out of places to put his material, and you'll see exactly how he does this. After queen d7, he opens up more files with cd5. The more files, the merrier. He plays queen takes d5, offering queen exchange. We don't want to exchange queens, at least not this second. So we're going to play queen c3, queen b5. He plays a4, hitting that queen again. Queen b4, and then he says, okay, if you really want to trade queens, I'll let you. And he plays the move h4, with the idea of putting his bishop on this long diagonal. Black gets the queens off the board, but he does this with tempo. And now black's position is completely frozen, and quite frankly, it's a little embarrassing. So he plays h6, and then rook a d1. We're already threatening rook d7, rook e8 mate, so black just needed to develop his bishop to some random square to cover the e8 square. So he does. He just throws it all the way out of the way. And then white just freezes black's pawns on the king side. And then develops his bishop to f5, just kind of showing how helpless black is. And black just gets kind of desperate and tries to find a way to break all these pins and break out of the position. He plays g6, and then white simply takes the material and allows the breakout, which black eventually manages to pull off, but he pulls off this breakout at the expense of being down a pawn and at the expense of white having two connected passed pawns. And with the combination of threats that white will continue to enjoy with the bishop pair against the still wide open king, and the fact that white has two connected passed pawns that he can start pushing down the board, black didn't have much of a chance in saving this game. So the game continued bishop c5, bishop f4, and then white just proceeded to combine threats against the king with threats of pushing his pawns, and he was eventually able to utilize all of these threats to force the exchanges of enough material that he could continue pushing his pawns and they couldn't be stopped. Black couldn't play bishop d4 because the pawn is holding it, and there's no way to now stop this pawn from simply going two more squares and making a queen. So black resigned, and that was in Nikolenko versus Yuzakov in Russia in 2009. And that is kind of how we should approach the queen d6 variation of the Scandinavian. We need to accept the fact that if black really, really wants to and puts all that pressure on the d4 pawn, we're going to lose it. But at the same time, that's what we want. Black should be careful what he wishes for. When we do lose that pawn, we're going to have open lines, open files, open diagonals, and we're going to have a ton of initiative and a ton of play for that pawn, and a ton of attacking potential for just one pawn worth of material. And that should be something that we should always be willing to do when we play chess. We should always be willing to sacrifice a pawn for positions like that. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. And if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe, and I will keep this content coming. Thank you very much for watching.